are still planning on killing him, right?
The point was to break his father.
This way you break him twice. Once in the pocket, once in the heart.
Now, in today's breakdown, we are going to be talking about the backstory of Ghost. We know we're going to be introduced to Ghost's grandmother, Grandma Charlene, and I do expect a lot of answers when we finally meet part of Ghost's family. Who knows if that's the only person we get introduced to, there may be more, but I'm sure she's got a lot of stories, a lot of history, and no doubt she will be a huge part of Ghost's upbringing, especially after the death of Curtis St. Patrick, which will no doubt help us plug some of the gaps in Ghost's story. She's also a character who will need care and assistance. I'm sure Ghost will be there for his grandma, just like Kanan was there for Joyce Thomas back in Raising Kanan Season 4. But Ghost's backstory and relationships go beyond just Grandma Charlene. And two in particular that I do want to break down over the next week or so in a bit more detail come from the same family, the Thomases, Jukebox and Kanan. Now, in this particular breakdown, we're just going to focus on the history with Jukebox, a question that I don't actually think will be answered in full in Power Origins, because Hailey Kilgore has told us she won't actually be returning for Power Origins. But if she isn't returning, then it does leave us with a lot of questions for how they end the story arc in Raising Kanan Season 5. And that's the agenda for today's breakdown. This breakdown will be very much a hybrid between what we saw and heard in OG Power, characteristics that we learned from the older Jukebox and also the younger Jukebox in Raising Kanan, what happens with the story arc in Season 5, as well as tying it in with Power Origins Season 1. Now, we know there's a lot of history here between Ghost, Tommy and Juke, especially if we are going by a few conversations with what we heard back in Power.
I ain't afraid of no fucking body.
Then why would you send your son in there against a man you raised up to be a gangster? You knew better.
Jukebox was a character who was very well aware of not just who Ghost was, but also how dangerous he was. She knew he was someone who always had his head in his books, but despite him being book smart and always studying, in the streets he was still a gangster. He was vicious with a piece. Ghost had that kind of reputation as a kid back in the 90s, and that is one of the traits I am expecting to see almost straight away based on where they're starting the timeline, which is in the early 2000s. It does also kind of just highlight the double life that we saw back in Power from Ghost when we were first introduced to him way back in episode 1. We saw his introduction as a legit businessman, the owner and boss of Club Truth, but beneath this character of James St. Patrick, beneath Club Truth in the loading dock, we saw his persona as Ghost. Upstairs to everyone here, he was James St. Patrick, but downstairs in the streets, he was a ruthless drug kingpin and a ruthless murderer. We were introduced to a character who just managed to seamlessly transition between the two personas. Now, he definitely could fool a lot of people like Simon Stern or people like he did business with, but he definitely couldn't fool someone like Jukebox. She's a character who can definitely smell bullshit and isn't afraid to call it out either. Most recently, we've seen her call out Rock in the final episode of Season 4, and that's with someone that she grew up with, someone that she loves and has a very close relationship with. We can also take it back to Season 1 of Raising Kanan, where she told Kanan that he wasn't fooling anyone with his tough guy act, and also admitting what Rock had him just do was simply crazy.
You look good, Ghost. All dressed up like a fucking civilian. People really believe that act?
She was someone who was able to see straight through people, and she told Ghost something very similar to what she told Kanan in Season 1. When we also speak about the red pill and blue pill of power, we often speak about how the environment sometimes shapes these characters. They don't know about the world that they live in until they grow a bit older. But Jukebox has always been a character who's shown she's very much ahead of her time. She was a lot more mature in the early stages of Raising Kanan than Kanan was. Not just because she was 1 or 2 years older than Kanan. She knew about the world that she lived in, she knew the consequences that came with it, she knew what her family were into and the consequences of that as well, hence why she never fucked with what Marvin was into. There was a moment where they were sitting outside just after Jukebox lost Nicole to the bad batch of drugs that Kanan cooked up, but she didn't actually blame Kanan. She blamed the world around them, their environment. She said, look at the fucked up place that they've grown up in, their influences around them. When they were at the park, she was teaching Kanan how to hustle. But having said that, let's go a little deeper. If you ask the question how and why she was ahead of Kanan, the answer is pretty simple. Kenya left her when she was a young baby, Marvin was also in jail for part of her childhood, and that meant she was raised by Rock, one of the most ruthless and toughest queenpin that we've seen in the Power universe, and we all know how close their relationship is, or was.
You used to live here, remember that? We just curl up on the couch and talk all night.
Now, no doubt Rock played a huge part in shaping the character that we now see on Raising Kanan, and also the character that we saw on Power, because of her early influence. Again, when you're younger, you really don't have the choice of your environment, upbringing, and who influences you. In this case, for Jukebox, it was rock. So Jukebox was a character who was very clued on about the world that she lived in, even at this young age when we met her back in season 1. And during seasons 1 and 2, you could tell she was a lot more mature than Kanan, a lot more independent. Kanan had his moms bring him milk and tucking him into bed at night, whereas with Juke, it would have been the complete opposite. Kenya just up and left when she was a baby, and she had a hard time with Marvin, who initially refused to accept who she was. So she is a character who's very well aware of her surroundings growing up, and it is her life experiences, what she's been through, which has definitely contributed towards a more independent and more mature Juke. But this also leads me on to how she knew who Ghost was, and also how she was very well aware of how close he was with Kanan.
Man, Ghost, he was your boy, that kid. Always with his head in the motherfucking book. Vicious with a piece, though.
We know about the relationship between Kanan and Ghost from what we heard and what we saw back in Power, but so did Juke. Jukebox knew how close these guys were, and based on their interaction with Ghost in season 4 when she kidnapped Tariq, clearly they definitely knew each other from back in the day. She mentioned that he looked good, dressed as a civilian, but do people really believe that? Which hints at the fact that she knew the real Ghost. She knew who he was from back in the day, what he was capable of. Even though he had his head in his books, there was definitely another side to Ghost. Very similar to what Tariq said after the death of Kanan.
These suits don't change who you are, and that suit can't change who I am.
These suits weren't going to fool people that knew the real James St. Patrick. But having said that, let's flip this and look at the other perspective of Ghost and Tommy also knowing who Juke was, based on them saying, remember Jukebox, Tommy mentioning Juke was a crazy bitch. But also the fact that we saw this facial reaction from Ghost when Kanan mentioned who had Tariq.
She run these streets harder than some of these men. Love pussy, but ain't got no heart. Jukebox.
Now, there weren't many people who could often scare Ghost. There were probably only a handful or a couple of moments that had Ghost spooked on Power. One of the most famous and one of my favorites was Milan. But the fact that we had Ghost spooked in this particular situation when he heard who held Tariq tells you everything you needed to know about what Ghost thought about Juke. 1. We know Ghost was scared because she had Tariq, she had his son. 2. Ghost is a character who thrived on having power and control, and during this particular moment, he had none. He wasn't the one calling the shots, Kanan and Juke were. And 3. It really did seem like Ghost knew what Jukebox was capable of based on his reaction and his conversation with Kanan, which we definitely know from what we've seen. The combination of what we've seen and heard from both the older and younger Jukebox, she really wouldn't have thought twice about killing Tariq, and I do think Ghost would have known that as well.
This way you break him twice. Once in the pocket, once in the heart.
Now, with Jukebox, there was also a bigger plot and storyline that was actually supposed to be explored originally in Power, and I'm just going to play you guys something that Courtney Kemp said a while back, and then we'll dig into it.
There are all these missed opportunities with dead folks. One thing that I never got to do was I never really got to cross Anika Noni Rose's character Jukebox with Tasha. I never got to get more of those relationships together. That would have been nice to do, but again, as some of you guys know, the reason that we had to kill Jukebox off was that Anika had to go be in the quad. It was not just that it was time for the character to go. And, someone asked Jukebox knew Tasha. No, I wanted her to cross with Tasha. I wanted Jukebox and Tasha to cross once Jukebox had kidnapped Tariq, if that makes sense, because Tasha would have had something to say about.
Now, she has mentioned this a couple of times in various Instagram lives and also mentioned it on the Crew Has It podcast as well. Jukebox was killed mid-season 4 when she hatched a plan to kidnap Tariq. Her plan was to hit Ghost where it hurts twice, once in the pocket and once through the heart. But the original plan for Juke was to actually come back to New York, have her cause chaos for Tommy and Ghost in the streets, cause chaos for their operation, family and everything else. There has also been a lot of speculation that Jukebox was originally supposed to kill Raina instead of Ray Ray as well. Her not being able to get to Tariq, her feeling betrayed by Kanan during this kidnapping. Maybe the original plan was to go back to Queens, cause chaos, where she then comes across Raina instead. The original plan was to have Jukebox around for a little longer in Power, and I have no doubt, zero doubt, that if Jukebox was in and around Queens a lot more, in a bigger plot or a storyline, she would have caused absolute mayhem for not just Tommy, Ghost, Tasha, Tariq, but maybe also for Kanan as well. From what we know about Jukebox as a character from the older and the younger version in Raising Kanan, she's very tough. She's not afraid to pull the trigger, cut people loose if she needs to, or where people disobey her. And she is also very strategic with her plans. her plan is always her plan. You either stick to it or you end up like dead. So I have no doubt in my mind that the actual plan and storyline that they had for Jukebox would have been absolutely insane in power. There would have been moments where she would have caused Ghost and Tommy some real trouble, had them scrambling, not knowing what's hit them. Ghost would have probably had trouble with Jason Michich, battles in the real world with Simon Stern, dealing with broken relationships at home with Tasha and Tariq, constant law enforcement problems, his relationship with Angela Valdez, a broken relationship with his brother and Tommy, and on top, to make it worse, he would have had to deal with Juke. I really do believe we all would have loved to have seen it, not just because we would have got to see Jukebox in a lot more action, but she would have also come face to face with Tasha as well. That's something that has been confirmed by Courtney Kemp that they did have plans for. The fact that she kidnapped Tariq, Tasha would have had something to say about that for sure. If they did intend for her to kill Raina as well, I'm pretty sure the storyline would have gone in the direction of Tasha wanting to get revenge and get that kill. No doubt Tariq, Ghost and Tommy would have also wanted to as well. But just as a mother, her losing a child, her losing her daughter, I think she would have probably wanted that kill. And that's the route which I think they would have particularly gone down had Jukebox killed Raina. Now, had she been in the storyline beyond when she was killed, we would have no doubt also learned more about her past, history, and maybe even more connections that she had. I'm sure if she had the face-to-face meet with Tasha, words would have been spoken, and she would have probably revealed more about what she knew, maybe even just to stir up the pot between Tasha, Ghost, and Tommy. Just her being back in the same environment of Kanan, Ghost, Tommy, and Tasha in New York, she would have had more time on screen and we would have had these conversations that revealed more about her backstory and relations. You also think about something Joseph Sikora recently said post-4 season 3. He mentioned Vic Flynn may be stronger in New York due to his Irish connections, but never underestimate Tommy on his home turf. He has home advantage. Well, the same could have also been said about Juke in this particular situation. She's also someone who grew up in Queens. She went through a lot, as we all know and have now seen. So I really wish they were able to have Juke a bit longer on power, because it would have been more than just her causing mayhem. They would have been able to reveal a lot of the history that went down between maybe Ghost, Jukebox, and also Tommy. I'm sure an interaction between Tommy and Juke would have been epic as well. But having said that, it does also now give the writers a lot of free reign here to kind of take a story in a few directions, and a direction they feel is right. Now, originally when we first explored the history of Ghost and Juke, I did mention because of their history and what was mentioned in Power, we would most likely see Jukebox at some point in Power Origins with her crossing paths with both Tommy and Ghost. We thought she would be in and around Queens, even though her and Kanan may have drifted apart, with Kanan breaking away from Rock and the Thomases, with him being more mentored and corrupted by Snaps and Pop, and with him being in the streets more with Breeze, Tommy and Ghost. We did think she would still be in and around the environment, just not as close as they once were. But Hailey Kilgore has actually been vocal over on social media about her not actually being in Power Origins. When she was asked whether she would be in Origins, her answer was a polite no. We also have to factor in with what we know in terms of where they're now starting the timeline of Power Origins. It does look like there will be a big time jump between the end of Raising Kanan Season 5 and the beginning of Power Origins, with much of the story in between in the late 90s most likely being covered through flashbacks and conversations. But if Hailey Kilgore says she's not returning for Power Origins, that probably means that we don't see her at all, which definitely does make us consider a few things going forward. Her story in Raising Kanan Season 5 is probably the last time we see the younger Juke, and it will either likely end with her leaving Queens and New York altogether, or she actually leaves at some point in between the end of Raising Kanan and the beginning of Power Origins because of the time skip. I personally think in Season 5 we will start to see the fallout between Kanan and Juke in Season 5, and they've definitely no doubt laid the foundations to that in a few different ways across the series. Sasha Penn has also teased that we will get the answers to this particular question. So I do think something big will happen between the two, and that will contribute towards them drifting further apart, along with other factors such as Snaps and Pops' influence, what happens with the Thomases and also Breeze's influence. But at some point, it does seem like she's going to be leaving Queens. Whether it be at the end of Raising Kanan or during the time jump that takes us up to the early 2000s when we get into Power Origins, I do think we all know the catalyst that will be the final nail in the coffin for Juke's character. She said it in conversation with Aisha in episode 10. She can't leave New York because she needs to look out for Marvin. Well, if Marvin is no longer here, then there's no reason for Jukebox to stay in New York. Could she go to Atlanta with Aisha? That invitation I'm sure will always be open. Or could she just go off there and do her own thing? As I mentioned before, she's a character who's very independent and likes to get things done on her own in her own way. For example, back in Season 1 we saw her hustling in the streets. She was hustling on her own to pay for her studio time. She didn't go to Rock, Marvin, or Uncle Lou for money. She hustled on her own and made it happen. In season 3, we saw her pursuing her music career. Fast forward season 4, we also saw her making the jump and joining the army. So she's never been afraid to go and chase what she wants, be on her own and be independent. We also know when we were introduced to a character in Power, she was a cop in DC, but that was also way after Kanan was sent to prison. Only then did Jukebox become a cop.
Officer Ganna is an 8-year veteran of the department. She is a member of the National Black Police Association.
The news report in Power mentioned she was a 8-year veteran of the police department, whereas Kanan had been in prison for 10, so she became a cop way after Kanan went inside. So one thing I'm going to give you guys a heads up with, don't expect the full answers to be given in terms of why she became a cop, because that happens much later in the timeline. I think we have been given a few clues and a few hints in terms of the people that she's interacted with across Raising Kanan, Detective Beck being one of them, but I don't think we'll get the full answers into her actually choosing that particular path. The same goes for why she changed her surname to Ganna. When she was introduced in Power, she was Officer Ganna, not Thomas. So at some point along the way, she would have also changed her name, but again, I do think that's probably too soon for her to do so in season 5. I don't think we see her changing her surname. That probably happens much later in the timeline as well, and something that we probably don't particularly see or even hear about. In terms of her not being in Power Origins, I don't think it's too much of a big deal in my particular opinion. I guess it would be nice to have her in 1 or 2 episodes making a one-off appearance, because we know there is a bit of history here between the characters, but it's definitely not as important as the story of Ghost, Kanan and Tommy. I guess with Jukebox they'll answer it in Raising Kanan season 5 and make it make sense by saying maybe she's left to go to Atlanta, maybe after the death of Marvin, maybe they mention that she's gone to DC after the downfall of the Thomases and after she drifts further away from Kanan. But her being a part of Power Origins is not as important as a story between Ghost, Kanan and Tommy. It's not as important as Breeze's influence and the story around Breeze, their upbringing and how they turned into the gangsters that we saw in Power. As I mentioned in one of my previous breakdowns, I think much of the story that we heard about in Power, we probably won't even see. No doubt we will see a lot of Easter eggs, there will be a lot of nods to Power, but I do think the sole focus will be these 2 characters turning into legends of the game. We've seen Jukebox's story with Raising Kanan. This is now the story of Tommy, Ghost and how Kanan played a part in that. Hopefully Breeze as well, although with that particular question, I have kind of asked that question, will Breeze be in Power Origins? If you guys haven't catched this particular breakdown, definitely give it a watch. But a lot of this backstory that we just went through in terms of Power, Jukebox knowing Ghost, Tommy, knowing how crazy she was, through to her going DC, becoming a cop and changing her surname, in my particular opinion, a lot of this will be left open to interpretation and perception. Sasha Penn says we'll get most of the answers, but not all, and I do think this particular one falls into the category where it's going to be open to interpretation. With that being said, drop all your thoughts down below in the comment section. This breakdown was very much a hybrid of a character analysis, backstory, and what we can expect going forward in Raising Kanan through to Power Origins. And again, with this one, I'm sure there will be a great ending to Raising Kanan Season 5. They will make it make sense, but I'm personally not expecting all the answers come the end, especially when it comes for Duke. But drop all your thoughts down below in the comment section, and as always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.